Hi, I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Carla Brown.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future.
If you're a first-time listener, welcome to the podcast of the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES. With every episode, we bring you stories from the field and insights from leading experts on all things biodiversity science, bringing critical issues into focus to make them accessible, understandable, and tangible.
Last time, we had a look at how biodiversity loss typically impacts women more than men around the world, and explored the experience of women in science in different contexts. It is a treat for me to be back with you again for this episode, Brit, even if just to share a fun fact I recently discovered. Did you know that online searches for the word rewilding have increased by 300% over the last 5 years?
Not just a fun fact. I'm going to go ahead and say that is an intriguing fact. It's immediately making me question why that is and what might be driving that increase. Of course, it's also very relevant to this episode, where we explore the concepts of rewilding and restoration as more than just buzzwords. We'll take a deeper dive into restoration success stories, as well as the many challenges of doing this work, through the personal experiences of two experts.
The first of those experts is Dr. Yvonne Walz. She's the head of the Environmental Vulnerability and Ecosystem Services Division at United Nations University Institute for Environment and Human Security. The love she has for her work struck me immediately, as did the scale of the challenges she described.
Nature or the ecosystems are right now really at an alarming state. Every second, 4 soccer fields of productive land is degraded right now, and this is why we urgently need to come back to restore ecosystems and let ecosystems thrive. It's not only an option, it's something we are depending on for our life and our well-being overall.
Absolutely. So what is the difference between rewilding and restoration?
The ambition is both of restoration or rewilding is to really heal nature. The restoration approach is really an active approach. So actively clean waters or plant trees and grow trees or restore peatlands that have been dried to re-wet them, for example. That is a restoration approach. And rewilding is rather a very passive approach where we leave nature on its own, let it grow and let the ecosystem thrive on its natural processes.
With climate change and climate change adaptation requiring us to change the way we think about what these ecosystems look like and how they need to be managed, does that mean that we need to start rethinking the word restoration itself? Because it sort of means, the word itself means going back to the status quo, going back to the way it was. Do we need to challenge that and rethink the word restoration and what it means?
I never thought about restoration in terms of going back, but yes, it is actually what the term implies also. And if we look at restoration, is that we want to actually repair a damaged environment, and that's the main ambition, not to heal the environment and make it a healthy spot. In terms of climate change, we have many impacts of climate warming on ecosystems in terms of structure and the dynamics. So considering this, maybe we need to add a connotation to restoration in terms of making it climate smart and forward-looking or adaptive. Ecosystems are developing under climate and environmental conditions. And right now, the climate conditions change. So if we would go back to where it was before, we have no ecosystem which is adapted to the current condition and especially not to the future conditions. So as ecosystems right now already change under climate change, it gives us the signal that we need to be forward-looking.
Can you talk to me a little bit about some of the institutional barriers to rewilding?
One consideration is that we have a lot of different conflicts on terms of how to manage and use land. And land tenure is also a very important point. For example, in Togo, where are actually 30 meters along the river, you are not allowed to do farming, to conserve the riverbeds and to prevent soil erosion, because there's also a lot of flood issues. But at the same time, people are very in need to access land for their livelihoods, because the development is really a big issue here at the same time. And that's an issue where I would see a need to provide other opportunities and to work with the people on solutions together, that this rule, which is a very good regulation, is actually enforced.
So, can you give me one example that really stands out to you of where this is being implemented successfully and what the process is there?
Yes. We have a very nice project that very much relates to this, a research project where we work together with the government of Togo in Togo. So the context is that Togo has a very nice ambition and commitment to plant 1 billion trees by 2030. This is a commitment of the government. And this very positive ambition to restore land is something we build on in collaboration with the Ministry of Environment, but also researchers on forestry and biodiversity from the local university. And we work also with a NGO that is based in the local communities and works with the people in the local communities on environmental concerns. And what we do there is actually to work together in this consortium with the people in the local context also. And we want to answer the question, which tree species and how, in order to address the multiple challenges we have simultaneously. And with challenges, I refer here to land degradation, soil erosion, and we have hydrological extremes. There are flood events and drought events which are impacting the livelihoods of the people. We also have climate change and want to adapt to climate change conditions in this context. And also, of course, the biodiversity crisis, which is very much affecting the West African region at all. The idea is that to support this forest landscape restoration approach in a very strategic way, science-based, in order to address simultaneously these goals and challenges.
It stands out to me that it's really important to engage different people at different levels and also engage the local communities in these processes. How do you go about making the local communities and the people who live there and the people who kind of live this reality every day are sometimes most impacted by it? How do you make them feel more involved, get them more involved, engage them in the first place in these processes?
Yeah, this is the most important part, that we are there, that we are working with them, we are listening, and that we work with local people in the region. It's not just us coming from outside there, but that we are going there, working with the people and this local NGO who has the mandate to work with them, who understands the communities, who knows them all. They have actually focal point in each of these communities, this NGO, and they are the ones who scale this up, let's say, no? So, and bring us in there, that we can facilitate the whole discussion in that direction. Whether you take the active or passive approach, I think it's very important that there's a lot of ownership in the local region, because this is the people are living with the land and from the land.
When we think about restoration and rewilding, and when we talk about it, we are often talking about areas of the global south, for example. But I assume that many areas in, for example, overdeveloped areas or more developed areas such as Europe also require restoration, and maybe requires even more restoration than the areas that we tend to think about when we talk about restoration. So do you have an example of a successful project or an ongoing project perhaps in Europe or North America?
Yeah, actually, it's true. We have such a densely settled area, both in North America, but also in Europe. And I think this is something where restoration is even more difficult to implement. And one, for me personally, outstanding example, not because I've been there, but because I really want to go there and have read about it, is the Carpathian forests in Romania, which is a very old growth native forests, which are even relicts where forests have not been touched yet by humans. And this is one of the major Natura 2000 areas, which are falling under a protected area. And what I really appreciate, that this is also an area where they are building up ecotourism, so that at the same time protecting and conserving such a precious native old growth ecosystem with a huge number of biodiversity, but also finding ways in a sustainable manner to bring people in there that we can repair our relationship with nature.
On a personal note, is there a specific memory that stands out to you where you were really sort of wowed or kind of brought back to you that this is why you're doing the work that you're doing?
I was 2 weeks trekking in the Arctic, and we were guests in a habitat, which is the habitat of polar bears. And there was one specific moment when I was actually feeling really very connected to nature. We had bear watches to protect the camp in the nights. And on one morning, it was my turn, and I was going through my binoculars, and I saw a polar bear at the hilltop. And this was really kind of a moment when my heartbeat was just stopping for a second and then going very fast. And it was at the same time, it was just such a gift. The polar bear was walking on the hillside, 500 meters of altitude top of us. It was not interested in us. It was in his habitat, and we were able to observe it, and it was just such a precious moment. And on the evening after that, I was having my bear watch duty, and we were at a glacier which is surging at the moment. And imagine this surging glacier, which is having like 45 meters of ice masses crashing down every 10 to 15 minutes. It's like a 20-story house or something, which is crashing into the water. And the most magic moment was then when I was really very intense looking out at the ice shields where the polar bear is coming, and out of a sudden my binocular were wide filled. And looking out of the binoculars, I saw a beluga whale just popping up like 10 meters in front of me. And I was feeling like this was a moment when I felt like, okay, I'm really in harmony with nature, and I'm so precious and happy and grateful to be a guest in this beautiful environment. We have to protect that.
What a breathtaking experience that must have been. I can't even imagine having seen that. And it's encouraging to hear that some progress has been made since the Abyss Land Restoration and Degradation Report launched 10 years ago, including a lot of new strategic restoration initiatives and targets. But, it's clear that many challenges remain.
And those challenges are exacerbated by resource gaps, especially in countries in the global south. And you can also find misalignment of actions and strategies, for example, the private and public interests.
Yeah, and misalignment of actions and strategies can be really difficult, especially when you have lack of resources, lack of time, even if resources are completely there. The interests and the values have to be there first.
As though that wasn't enough, there's also environmental challenges. So, for example, what Yvonne was saying about climate change and how the restoration work has to shift around how the climate is changing and how the climate is changing the environment.
It's constant catch up, because immediately as you are thinking about restoration, the thing you are restoring itself is changing. Nothing is static at all in the entire process, start to finish.
Something that might guide us here is the UNCCD, or the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, and their goal of land degradation neutrality, which they have labeled really beautifully restoring life to land.
Restoring life to land. It was so awesome to hear the different initiatives that she mentioned. Really inspiring considering the challenges we're up against. The initiative in Togo, I thought, was particularly illustrative of just what can be done when there is the desire to do it and then the means and the dedication. And, I also think of something like Pakistan's 10 billion tree tsunami, this idea that we have places that are setting these goals that might seem kind of astronomical, but they are on their way to reaching.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because speaking of tsunamis...
Oh, I see what you're doing there. Is it time for the ocean?
It is. On the ball, as always, Brit, we are going back to the ocean. But this time, not with the Captain Darwin expedition, but with Professor Sebastian Villasante. He's the director at the Equal Sea Lab, and he's currently one of the coordinating lead authors on the IPBES Spatial Planning and Connectivity Assessment, as well as the second global assessment, where he is a lead author. When we think of restoration, we tend to, or at least I tend to, envision terrestrial restoration like tree planting initiatives, like we just mentioned. And while, of course, that's absolutely important, it's not the only ecosystem we should be focusing on. The IPBES Global Assessment found that only 3% of the ocean is free from human pressure. Sebastian's research is focused on the impact of human activity and climate change on marine ecosystems. And it's clear that he's very passionate about his work today, but his connection to the ocean goes all the way back to his childhood.
My connection to the sea began in the childhood, basically. My father worked on board. Almost every weekend I was going to with him to the sea. And I remember when I was a kid to smell the salt in the air and the quiet moments when we were watching the horizon together, for example. And those days shaped strongly and the way that I understood the ocean, not just a place of work, but just a place full of life, marine life, right? And people life, stories and meanings for me, right? And I lost my father when I was 13, and since then I try to keep the ocean remaining a way to stay close to him. And my work, in many ways, is a continuation of our conversations and our talks about caring the oceans and about sustainable the people who depend on it, right? And the sea is my connection to him, and with my full family, all of my family members that has been emigrating 5-6 decades ago from Spain to Argentina. And this will continue to give purpose to my life.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And thank you for sharing that. And I think that's a very powerful tribute to your father as well, continuing this work and this kind of legacy of this connection that you had with him and with the ocean. Sometimes I think it might be difficult to quantify loss. And often I think, okay, when do we say that there has been loss, or when do we say there's been restoration? So when we think about quantifying the problem of marine biodiversity loss, what exactly are we up against?
Well, usually when we talk about marine life, I would say that scientifically speaking, scientists until now, we were able to develop methods or tools just to focus on a specific species. So, for example, how much of sardine or cod you are able to extract from the ocean to then sell it into the market, right? So this has been and still is the predominant way to try to measure how much fish we can extract from the ocean. Maybe 20%, 50%, and we scientists usually set up like thresholds or limits, how much of fish in order to allow the fish to reproduce year by year. But when you talk about marine life, it's more difficult because usually we do not have, at least in the ocean, except in some cases, we don't have specific tools to really try to understand how the species connect with each other, who eat what, for example, in the oceans, right? Just very recently, maybe in the last, I would say 15 or 20 years, we will be able to develop ecosystem models in order to see how species interact each other, to what extent anthropogenic pressures like pollution, overfishing, or climate change are affecting the state of these species and the state of these interactions. In general, the international organizations or governments, for example, are now advocating for the 30-for-30, right, to protect the oceans, which is 30% of the ocean by 2030, right? And this is very important and very relevant because you are able to just protect the ocean from any fishing activity or any human activity, right? And we depart from the idea, from the conception that if we do not touch the ocean will recover. And conceptually speaking, this is a powerful measure, right? And this is, I would say, generally the most predominant way that we scientists or governments are able to protect the ocean until now.
Are there specific areas or specific species that you feel, in your expert opinion, we need to focus on more in terms of protection, in terms of conservation?
I would say that in the oceans, we know that several species are very important, but depends on when you put the focus, right? If you ask the governments or you ask the private sector, most probably they will say, oh, let's try to protect those species that they are more value economically, right? But this is one part of the story, because then there are also other species that they are not, they do not have price market, and we as humans are not able to pay for them. right? But they are very important in the role of the ecosystem, in the network of the ecosystem, the food web of the ocean, because they play a key role in sustaining these ecological interactions to have a healthy ocean, right? So it depends on when you put the focus, right? And until now, I will say that most of the focus has been predominantly concentrated into the economic value of the species, right? And we need to shift this narrative, right? And we need to shift the way that we value nature. It's not just how much a given species value, right?
And we talk about economic level, and so obviously that is a human impact. But what is the impact of this decline at a greater human level when we talk about the stories, the cultural connection? What are we losing when we lose these species and these ecosystems?
Well, on the first, let's say, high level, I will say, well, you lose employment, 1,000 or even million of employment. For example, we are seeing, because we are crossing the tipping point on the coral reef, for example, we know globally that coral reefs provide employment of more than 500 of million of jobs globally, right? Just for the coral reef, for example, and more than 3.2 billion of people depend on the oceans directly or indirectly, right? By generating food. So it is very important for the oceans because they provide us not only job, but also cultural value, our relation with the ocean, right? Our gastronomy, our way of even thinking and generating culture is deeply connected with the oceans. And third, I will say that it's very important the nutritional value. From the 20 most important species, not only from the oceans, but also from terrestrial species that we humans usually eat every day in the planet, we know that the 10 most important ones from the nutritional value are coming from the oceans, right? Especially small pelagics like sardine or mackerel or horse mackerel, for example, right? So if we overfish or if we lose the capacity of the ecosystem or they are collapsed, we are not losing only the generation of jobs, but also cultural aspect and nutritional value for people, right? Which are very important, globally speaking.
So the question of all questions, how do we tackle restoration?
Well, I would say that we don't have the recipe or a panacea, right? But we know two things. We know several examples that they are working around the world. And they are using some management systems and they are working in a way that they are achieving sustainability of fishery on the one hand, and on the other hand, well-being of fishers, for example, or people who depend on the ocean, right? What are these, I would say, common characteristics? On the one hand, I would say that one aspect is to work together. Fishers, scientists, and officers from the administration sit in a table and year by year, well, discuss what is the state of the resources and jointly decide what is the amount of fish that they are able to extract from the ocean. And the co-management system around the world has been proven scientifically that probably is the most efficient and the more equitable fisheries management system that is able to effectively deliver sustainable and fisheries in the oceans, right? That is one thing. The other thing I would say is that in several cases around the world is the establishment of or creation of marine protect areas. Marine protect areas has been proven themselves to really improve the state of the fisheries resources from the ecological perspective.
Can you give a specific example of where a co-management approach has been successful?
Well, there are several of them, I would say, around the world. But one that we have been working closely and we know quite well is the establishment of a marine reserve called Os Miñarsos here in Galicia, northwest of Spain. I would say that this is an example, a good example of transformative change in small-scale fisheries, which has been co-created by fisheries scientists and the government, based on shared values that support sustainable local fisheries on the one hand, on the other hand, the well-being of their communities that depend on the marine protect area, right? And the process of knowledge co-creation, for example, was started by sharing traditional knowledge For example, the fishery started to share, well, where are the most sensitive and productive habitat and species within that area, right? With scientists and management organizations. So we scientists, we learn from the fisheries and they learn from us, right? This was a co-construction. It was a complex process and not without tensions, of course, right? Because transformative change implies conflict and tensions most of the time, right? And contested actions, right? So I will say that more than almost 20 years after the implementation, this marine protect area has generated both positive effect on the abundance of species, but also on the economic revenues. People now get more money from the ocean, right? And go less time to fish, so they can stay on land more time with their families, for example, right? And also they achieve a greater trust and cooperation among the actors, right? And this started with a really small fishing community here in the northwest of Spain. And this example was able to inspire not only other fishing communities here in Spain, but also in Portugal, and more recently served the seed to create a new network of small-scale fisheries in Ibero-American countries, not only including Spain and Portugal, several Latin American countries as well, and involving more than 20 million of small-scale fisheries between the two both sides of the Atlantic.
With the right model and the right collaboration and the right actions, how soon can a marine species or marine ecosystem that has been degraded recover?
Well, this is a typical Galician answer. It depends.
How long is a piece of string? Yeah.
Yes, it depends. But usually, well, for example, according to the evidence that we know, the scientific evidence, we are able to rationally say that after the implementation of a marine protect area, for example, you need to, depending on the area, of course, and the characteristic of the actors, but in general, I would say that we know that you need to wait and more or less 1 decade. After that, 1 decade, you are able to see, promising results or outcomes in terms of the recovering of nature or recovering of the ocean on the one hand, and recovering of, let's say, quality of life of people.
Is there scope for optimism still? And where do you find that? Where do you find that hope yourself?
My hope is that we are all right now in this time of history all together here, right? So we have the capacity to deliver something different. And I really trust and I hope from the bottom of my heart to really try to work together for us and for our kids and our generations. This is my hope. And this is what I will be doing for the rest of my life.
You know, there is so much negative news out there. It's hard to not become just despondent. But hearing Sebastian's optimism and passion was something I really needed. Curious if you also got some optimism from that conversation with him.
Absolutely. That was something that really stood out to me in speaking to Sebastian, is that there is so much value in having and maintaining that personal connection and passion for the work that you do. And I think so many scientists or people working in this field actually share that.
And it's, at the end of the day, teams of people. It's co-management. How we can actually apply that to other scenarios, to other projects. Though there are unique challenges when it comes to marine restoration and rewilding. Data deficiency comes to my mind immediately. I mean, at the end of the day, we are terrestrial animals. And the idea of like studying and knowing enough about not our home to protect it or restore it or rewild it is daunting to me.
Another issue that I thought about immediately is the fact that you have different jurisdictions when it comes to marine environments. So there are legal challenges to restoration in terms of who owns this ocean, who manages it, who regulates who fishes in it and who exploits it.
You know, beside that, I think at the end of the day, the values of marine environments and marine ecosystems, you know, it's not just economics. It's also not just biodiversity. I mean, this is important to humans on a cultural level. I think Sebastian and I would both agree it is of worth to us in ways that are far beyond what might be measurable by some metric.
It reminds me of the IPBES values assessment, where the values in nature can be tracked all the way from living with nature all the way to living as nature. And that perspective changes depending on the context, the specific cultural community that you find yourself in. At the end of the day, the value goes beyond, as you said, the economics.
And those values inform practices like restoration, like rewilding, as we enter and continue on in this age of humans. So that's it for this episode of Nature Insight Speed Dating with the Future. I'm Brit Garner.
And I'm Carla Brown. Join us in the next episode to hear more about the importance and values of biodiversity in urban areas.
Is it possible to balance the needs of nature and cities? Tune in next time to find out. And in the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of their social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Nature Insight wherever you get your podcasts.